let's just get on with introducing our first panel. I just want to do a little lay of the land for you all. Each presenter will have 8 minutes, and after that, we'll have 4 minutes for questions. So please put your questions in the reaction button, the Q&A, and your reaction button down at the bottom, which will really help me because I will not have, I don't have the ability to look through chat for your questions. So please, please, we want to get to as many questions as we can. So please put them in the form of questions, and then also raise your hand. And then for questions again, please put them in form of a question so that our presenters can best answer them. We have the wonderful advantage of having 4 excellent speakers today. The first, we have Alan Robock, just to let you know, Alan Robock, David Boris, Medea Benjamin, and Trita Parsi. Starting with Alan Robock. Alan is a distinguished professor of client science in the Department of Environmental Sciences at Rutgers University in New Jersey. He earned a PhD from MIT in 1977, and before graduate school served as a Peace Corps volunteer in the Philippines. Among other things, he's worked on the impacts of nuclear war on climate and food for the past 40 years. Thank you, Alan.
You want me to do my talk now, or you? Oh,
please,
okay.
Yes.
All right, sure.
Please.
Let me share my screen. And okay, thank you very much for having me. And I wanted to talk about the global famine after a nuclear war. This work was done by a bunch of old guys in the past, but we also have a bunch of young people who, and women and men who are crop modelers and climate modelers and oceanographers. We've written lots of journal articles, which you can get from my website, but I just want to summarize it. Here's our beautiful planet. But after a nuclear war, it might look like this, with a cloud of smoke covering the northern hemisphere, moving into the southern hemisphere, blocking out the sun. This would come from fires started by nuclear weapons targeted on cities and industrial areas. If there was enough smoke, temperatures would get below freezing, even in the summertime, and we call that nuclear winter. Obviously, it would have devastating effects on agriculture. The first paper that made this clear was by Paul Crutzen and John Birx, who pointed out that there would be fires after nuclear war. And so here's a graph of the total number of nuclear weapons deployed on the planet. And you see there was an arms race up to the 1980s, and then the arms race ended. And the Crutzen and Birx paper was published in 1982. Then a group of American scientists and Russian scientists calculated how the climate would change, and they said it would be nuclear winter. I did a paper also the next year, and a group, an American group did, and then the arms race ended. It wasn't because the Soviet Union ended. That ended 5 years later. And by the way, there's still 10,000 nuclear weapons on the planet. Although the number's been going down, it stopped going down, and that's the problem. So I think what we did in the 1980s had something to do with the end of the arms race. Ronald Reagan, one of the 2 people who made the decision, was US president. He said a great many reputable scientists are telling us such a work ended up in no victory for anyone, and it would cause a nuclear winter. And Mikhail Gorbachev also said models made by Russian American scientists showed a nuclear war would result in a nuclear winter. So if we look back to World War II, this is a map drawn by the US Army of all the cities that were firebombed in Japan in the summer of 1945. That was the policy, to just kill civilians. And The 68th and 69th cities were Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the only difference was they only needed one bomb for those, not multiple incendiary bombs. In Hiroshima, a 15 kiloton bomb killed about 150,000 people. And this picture on the left is the mushroom cloud made when the bomb exploded, but the picture on the right is a pyrocumulonimbus. It's a thunderstorm generated from the heat from the fires, and which was started in Hiroshima. And this is 3 hours after the attack. This is not the mushroom cloud. And this smoke was pumped up into the upper atmosphere where it lasted for a long time. This is pictures drawn by one of the survivors. And this is what Hiroshima looked like afterwards. Everything burned. 3 days later, this bomb, the Fat Man plutonium bomb, was dropped on Nagasaki. Here's the mushroom cloud, and Nagasaki also looked like that. So it's not just nuclear weapons that can burn cities. In 1906, there was an earthquake in San Francisco. Jack London wrote about it, and he said there was a vast conflagration. I watched the vast conflagration from out on the bay. It was dead calm. Yet from every side, wind was pouring upon the doomed city. The heated air rising made an enormous suck. Thus did the fire of itself build its own colossal chimney through the atmosphere. So this is a pyrocumulonimbus that pumps smoke up into the atmosphere too. This is what San Francisco looked like afterwards. So there's more than 12,000 nuclear weapons on the planet. This is calculated by the University of Nagasaki. And the US and Russia have most of them, more than 90%, but there's 7 other countries that have nuclear weapons too. And so this is a satellite picture. So they could have a nuclear war too. This is a satellite picture of, this is India and Pakistan. And we started working almost 20 years ago. What would happen if they had a nuclear war? And it turns out that they could produce a lot of smoke too, 5 million tons. And we calculated what the climate response would be. And here's a movie of where the smoke would go. It would be blown around the world and it would go up into the upper atmosphere. This is the troposphere where we live, and there's no rain in the stratosphere to wash it out, and it would last for years. And it would produce instant climate change. It wouldn't be nuclear winter, but temperatures would get below the Little Ice Age. We also then said, what would happen if the US and Russia had a nuclear war? And a lot more smoke. And temperatures would get very cold in the summer. This is the first summer. We took a point in the Ukraine and looked at the temperature. This is freezing, 0 degrees Celsius. And normally in the summer, it gets warm in the summer and cold in the winter. But if you put the smoke in, temperatures would get below freezing for a couple years. Clearly, this is nuclear winter. And we've done more recent calculations, and we now know that Pakistan and India could have up to 400 or 500 nuclear weapons, bigger targets. And we calculated what would happen if they had a nuclear war today. And so we looked at these scenarios. India and Pakistan could use different numbers of weapons, different size weapons. US and Russia could still produce a nuclear winter. And this is a horrific number of direct fatalities from dropping these number of bombs. Billions and millions of people. In World War II, about 50 million people died. So India and Pakistan could kill more people directly than in all World War II. But it's much worse than that. We then said, well, what would happen to the temperature? These are the India-Pakistan cases. Temperatures would get below 5 degrees Celsius, same as ice age temperatures for 5 years. US and Russia would get even colder for 5 years until the smoke started to fall out. And we looked at how it would affect agriculture. It would get darker, it would be colder, and there'd be less rainfall. All of these things would affect agriculture. And we wrote a paper 2 years ago now on what would happen to food. And we calculated for each country in the world how much food they could grow. And we looked at what their diets were. And we used a crop model, and we considered livestock, and we looked at how the temperature would change, and we looked at fish. And it turns out that for these India-Pakistan cases, 20 to 40% of the number of calories available would be reduced. In the US and Russia, 90% of the calories would be reduced, averaged over the world for years.
Alan, One
Yes.
more minute?
Yes.
One more minute?
Okay. And so we calculated how many people would be alive after 2 years if they couldn't grow because of the climate change. This is for an India-Pakistan case. Uh, the dark number colors are people number of people that would starve. A large number at high latitudes. For an India-Russia case, most people in most of the northern hemisphere would die. And so now I'm adding a column to this chart. This is the number of people that would die because of starvation. It's more than 10 times the number of the direct effects. Almost 20 times as many people would die. A war between India and Pakistan could kill 1 to 2 billion people. A US-Russia war could kill most of the Earth's population. So we looked at analogs. I don't have time to show them to you. Well, this is after a big volcanic eruption. For 3 years following Tambora's explosion, to be alive almost anywhere in the world meant to be hungry. So the conclusions are that the current nuclear arsenal could produce nuclear winter, and nuclear winter could kill most of humanity. So I'll end there. Hope we learn from this so our beautiful planet looks like this for a long time to come.
Okay, thank you, Alan. You've given us a lot of information. Oftentimes we talk about uh, how do we get people to talk and deal with the dangers of nuclear war. And you certainly have given us a lot of information about those dangers and the dangers of nuclear weapons. And I'm reminded, having come from the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons Conference, that the need for getting the nuclear armed nations to sign on to that treaty. Thank you very much. I
Sure.
getting to questions. I was in error. There is no Q&A button at the bottom.
Yeah, I
So,
didn't see one.
right. So please raise your virtual hand, and that is in the reactions button down at the bottom, so that I can see your hand. And please, again, make your question a real short question so Alan can answer it.
Ruth.
And let's see, do I see any questions? Timon.
I think there was someone before me, but my question, Alan, is about the targeting of military targets rather than cities, like the missile silos and submarine bases and so on. Have you looked at that and compared what the results would be?
Yes, if you just targeted missile silos out in the desert, they would be ground bursts. They would kick up a lot of dust, and they wouldn't produce a lot of smoke. So that would have much less climate impacts. But there are many military targets in cities. There's this funny five-sided building in Washington. There's command and control. There's airports, and so when I talk to military people, they all include cities. There's like maybe 50 targets in Moscow and probably as many in New York and Washington. And so you can't count on that just military targets out where there's nothing to burn.
Okay, thank you. Now, Ellen, you said Ruth. I don't see her hand,
I
but
saw a hand and then it disappeared. That's what
okay.
Timon
Well,
saw
let's go
too.
with
I just wanted to say stunning, stunning presentation, accessible to anyone. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you, Ruth. Let's go to Aaron.
Yes, thank you for that very clear and troubling, distressing presentation. My question is whether you have modeled smaller scale conflicts than an all-out nuclear exchange between two large nuclear powers.
Yes, I showed that graph, that table of what matters is how much smoke there is. And so when we looked at India and Pakistan 20 years ago, maybe 5 million tons of smoke. The US and Russia could produce 150 million tons of smoke. But there's many other scenarios of how nuclear war might be fought between India and China, the US and China, North Korea, and so forth. And so it doesn't matter who the combatants are. What matters is how much smoke gets up there. people talk about limited nuclear war, but I don't know how to limit nuclear war once it starts. So the danger is it would be much larger scale, but the climate response depends on how much smoke goes in the atmosphere.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jeff,
Quick question, Alan. Are those smoke contaminated or like part of the fallout?
Salamat. I was in the Peace Corps in the Philippines, so recognize your
Yeah,
accent.
thank you.
We modeled black carbon particles, but there would be a lot of other stuff too, including organics and things coating it. But they might be destroyed by ozone quickly. And so right now we're working on putting more complex characterization of the smoke to see what difference it makes. If the particles are larger, they would fall out faster too, but we're working on that.
we have time for one more quick question. Peter.
Alan,
Donald was there first, I guess.
nuclear winter strikes me as a gross understatement. Can't we come up with a better term? It was coined way back when nobody believed it. And I think, in fact, it was proposed by the nuclear war planners or the folks who were on their side. Maybe not, but
No.
okay.
What happened was Turco et al. Were going to give a talk about climatic effects of nuclear war. They worked for NASA, and NASA told them you can't use nuclear war in the title, we'll lose our funding. So they thought up nuclear winter. And so what would you propose? I mean, there would be a lot of disruption of infrastructure, of communication, and there are a lot of other side effects from nuclear war in addition to climate response. But what would you suggest?
Well,
I think it's pretty good branding myself.
With that, Peter, you can put your suggestions into chat. And Alan, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
So much for your presentation. Next, we go on to David Boris. Now, David is a longtime leader and organizer in the Chicago Peace Action, a friend and fellow advocate. He could not be here today, but he has sent us a video. So, Cole, let's hear from David.
Good afternoon. My name is David Boris, and I speak as a board member of Chicago Area Peace Action. I'm sorry I'm unable to join you in person today, but I want to thank you all so much for holding this important conference on a topic that, unfortunately, does not get the attention it deserves in the mainstream media. I've been asked to address the folly of buying and building new ICBMs, and I think this very title is a good place to begin. Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines folly as 1, lack of good sense or normal prudence and forethought, and 2, criminally or tragically foolish actions or conduct. And so I want to be clear that we are not simply looking to have an informed debate on the nuance of nuclear weapons policy, on a path to complete disarmament, or on a protocol with time-certain metrics to ultimately eliminate nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. Those are indeed critical conversations to have, and to have in a robust fashion. But today, we're instead talking about the absolute foolhardiness, and yes, criminal and tragic conduct involved in developing and deploying a new generation of the most destructive weapons on the face of the earth, intercontinental ballistic missiles, armed with 1.2 megaton nuclear warheads, each missile possessing approximately 80 times the destructive force of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Allow me to lay out my top 3 reasons for seeing the replacement of over 400 Minuteman III missiles with a new Sentinel missile, formerly known as the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent, as an exercise in folly. 1, the cost. 2, the incentives for and dangers of early or accidental launch. And 3, the sacrifice of global leadership. For a small bit of background and an understanding of the cost, I bring us back to April 5th, 2009, when the newly inaugurated President of the United States, Barack Obama, spoke in Prague and declared, quote, "I state clearly and with conviction America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons." Tragically, only 12 short months later, stumbling blindly into a Faustian bargain with Congress to get the New START treaty approved. This same president authorized the nuclear modernization program, a then estimated $1.7 trillion program to modernize and upgrade our entire nuclear capability, with $264 billion alone set aside for the replacement of the 400 ICBMs that comprise the land-based leg of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. In a nation that struggles to feed its children, 13 million children live in food insecure homes, provide necessities to families. 1 in 6 children in the U.S. live in poverty, and where we suffer critical shortages of doctors and nurses, 340,000 and growing by the year, we can ill afford such a tremendous waste of resources and the deployment of weapons developed to, according to the joint statement of the 5 nuclear-armed states that are party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, quote, fight a war that cannot be won and must never be fought. And while disclosures just this past month by the Pentagon itself on the staggering cost overruns for this ill-advised venture to begin with might stop the current program temporarily, you can rest assured that the concept of refurbishing this uniquely destabilizing element of our nuclear arsenal is not slated to go away, making our opposition ever more important. And the destabilizing nature of this aspect of our nuclear arsenal, the land-based component of our nuclear triad, on which almost every military and foreign policy expert agree, is the least effective and most dangerous leg of what we call our nuclear deterrent. It is fixed in position, not mobile, and well known to all of our potential adversaries. As a matter of fact, our own Defense Department refers to these missile silos as the sponge, meaning they are meant, in the unthinkable scenario of all-out nuclear war, to soak up hundreds of incoming nuclear weapons so they will be diverted from cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, or Chicago, effectively sacrificing as a nuclear bait the 10.2 million residents of the 5 states that house the silos. But knowing that, our potential adversaries simply keep large enough arsenals to target the silos and the aforementioned cities, among other targets. Witness China's current nuclear modernization program of its own is an example where they mean to expand their current arsenal of about 300 warheads to over 1,500 by 2030. And most importantly, unlike the submarine and air legs of our nuclear arsenal, these weapons, once launched, cannot be recalled and have no self-destruct mechanism. Finally, most of these weapons are set under a trigger alert, giving a US president about 20 minutes to decide whether to launch and effectively eliminate 60 to 70% of all life on Earth. It is hard to imagine a word other than folly to describe this arguably insane policy. Finally, global leadership. The American people like to think of this country as, at best, the indispensable nation, or at the very least, the nation that sets and adheres to standards around equal justice, fair play, and executing foreign policy with foresight. That was the aspirational emotion captured by Obama's powerful 2009 speech in Prague. Instead, the hypocrisy embodied just 12 short months later is simply staggering. Combined with our response to September 11th, which virtually every reputable foreign policy expert and historian now recognize as one of the great missed opportunities in all of US history, the immensely flawed decision to invade Iraq, which has destabilized the Middle East for generations to come, and our belligerent, provocative, and short-sighted behavior toward China, the United States is clearly turning squandering global opportunities for leadership into its own unique art form. And the only proper description of such behavior is pure folly. Let's hope, and not simply hope, but take on the work and not shrink from this deep and abiding imperative to continue with all available means and the utmost of energy to stop this nuclear madness and call out the folly of building a new generation of the instruments of Armageddon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. This is something that I remember Noam Chomsky coming back to time and time again. The ICBMs are dangerous, they are expensive, and we need to organize to get rid of them, not spend money to make them bigger and better. Cole, do you see Medea? Is she?
Medea sent a video.
Oh, she did.
There's a big
Wonderful.
Palestine protest today, and she's at that.
Okay, wonderful. Well, let me just say, Medea Benjamin. Medea Benjamin is the co-founder of CodePink, Global Exchange, Peace in Ukraine Coalition, Unfreeze Afghanistan, ASEER, which is the Alliance for Cuba Engagement and Respect, and the Nobel Peace Prize for Cuban Doctors Campaign, and an author. She brings intelligence, passion, humor, and humanity in her advocacy against war and for peace. She is the woman I think of when you say a person speaks truth to power. That is Medea. So let's hear from Medea.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. I'm so sorry I'm not there in person, but I wanted to speak about Ukraine and the potential for a nuclear war. We will soon be marking the second anniversary of the war in Ukraine. While the war in Gaza has eclipsed the Ukraine war in terms of public attention and even ferocity, especially in its impact on children and innocent civilians, the war in Ukraine continues unabated. Since the failure of Ukraine's much touted counteroffensive, it is commonly understood that the war is at a standstill, with Ukraine unable to dislodge Russia from controlling about 18% of Ukraine's pre-2014 territory. The U.S. government continues to support Ukraine with a $60 billion package pending in Congress. While there has been some opposition to U.S. funding of this war, particularly from the Freedom Caucus of the Republican Party, for the most part, both parties support the war. The White House, instead of pressing for negotiations, has consistently encouraged Ukraine not to negotiate. Some U.S. officials see this war as a way to weaken Russia without risking U.S. lives. But this cynical calculation has led to the deaths of many Ukrainian civilians and soldiers, as well as many conscripted Russian soldiers who do not want to fight and die in this senseless war. As long as the war continues, there is also the risk that it will turn into a wider regional war, as well as the risk of a nuclear war, especially since this is in part a proxy war between the United States and Russia, which together possess over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. The U.S. 2018 Nuclear Posture Review said that the U.S. would use nuclear weapons, quote, only in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of the United States and its allies, end quote, which were already deliberately vague conditions, but it explicitly included a nuclear response to, quote, significant non-nuclear attacks. It provided examples of what such an attack could include, but it also stated it was not limited to these. In effect, it removed any firm restriction at all on a U.S. nuclear first strike. On the Russian side, in June 2020, President Putin stated, quote, the Russian Federation reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in response to the use of nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction against it or its allies, and also in the case of aggression against the Russian Federation with the use of conventional weapons when the very existence of the state is put under threat, end quote. So Russia's policy also left a lot to interpretation, leaving it up to Russia's leaders to determine at what point an ever-escalating war on Russia's borders was going so badly that it put the very existence of the state under threat. To make matters worse, the 11-to-1 imbalance between US and Russian military spending has the effect of increasing Russia's reliance on its nuclear arsenal, particularly tactical nuclear weapons, since its conventional forces are more limited than those of the United States. Unlike strategic nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons are designed to be used in a battlefield in a war. Both the United States and the USSR developed these weapons in the 1950s. The use of a tactical nuclear weapon would not necessarily lead to a full-scale nuclear war, but it certainly could. And so it would entail huge existential risks. In a public speech on April 14, 2022, CIA Director William Burns warned about complacency over these dangers. He said, "None of us can take lightly the threat posed by a potential resort to tactical nuclear weapons or low-yield nuclear weapons," end quote. Most Western predictions about whether Russia would use nuclear weapons are based on statements by Russian officials. But whether Russia is backed into a corner in which it would decide to use nuclear weapons also depends very much on Western policy. The USDIA's assessment that Russia sees the use of a tactical nuclear weapon as an option to bring its enemy to the table to sue for peace on Russia's terms underlies the double danger of aggressive Western policies. On the one hand, by encouraging Ukraine to reject talks with Russia, the West put Russia in precisely the spot that its doctrine on tactical use of nuclear weapons is designed to address. If Western leaders were deliberately trying to goad Putin into using a tactical nuclear weapon, this would be the surest way to do it. On the other hand, this aggressive Western policy suggests that if Russia actually used a tactical nuclear weapon, the same Western leaders would surely double down on treating Russia as a pariah that nobody should ever negotiate with, which would only make further nuclear escalation more likely. Some Western politicians might even see Russia's breaking of the nuclear taboo as opening the door for them to use nuclear weapons as well. The whole concept of tactical nuclear weapons that the United States, NATO, and Russia have all been toying with is a quest for a way around the nuclear taboo and the assumption that any use of nuclear weapons would escalate to mutually assured destruction and nuclear winter. But we are in uncharted territory. Both sides have obviously carried out simulations and developed strategies to permit a limited tactical use of nuclear weapons while trying to prevent it from escalating into full-scale nuclear war. But the only thing that is certain and predictable about war is that it is inherently chaotic and unpredictable. Nobody can be sure that the first nuclear explosion in Ukraine would not lead to Armageddon. As nuclear weapons experts agree, the difficulty in predicting and preventing nuclear war is that, while the probability might seem low in a given situation, a nuclear war would be the greatest catastrophe in human history and end life as we know it, and is therefore unacceptable under any circumstances. So the kinds of calculations that can be applied to other risks simply don't apply. And the only way to be truly safe is to eliminate nuclear weapons altogether. The United States has rejected numerous opportunities to cooperate with Russia on nuclear weapons over the years, dating back to the end of World War II, when President Truman rejected pleas to turn the bomb over to the United Nations under international supervision. President Reagan rejected President Gorbachev's request that he give up deployment of a Star Wars missile defense system in space as a condition for both countries to eliminate all their nuclear weapons. Under President Clinton, the United States failed to ratify the 1996 Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and has still not done so, while Russia ratified it in 2000. President Clinton refused President Putin's proposal to cut the country's massive nuclear arsenals to 1,500 weapons each if the United States agreed not to place missile sites in Romania. President George W. Bush walked out of the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and made plans to build an anti-ballistic missile base in Poland. After at first canceling Bush's planned ABM base in Poland, Obama later built one in Romania and revived the plan for one in Poland. Obama vetoed Russian and Chinese proposals for a ban on weapons in space in the consensus-bound UN Conference on Disarmament, and also blocked a proposal from Russia to negotiate a cyber war ban treaty. President Trump placed a second missile base in Poland and pulled the U.S. out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. The single remaining pillar of nuclear arms control is the New START Treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which limits Russia and the United States to an equal number of deployed strategic warheads and weapons carrying them, in force since 2011. It was about to expire just as President Bush entered office, but the two countries agreed to extend it. It was about to expire just as President Biden entered office, but the two countries agreed to extend it until 2026. Meanwhile, both countries are busy modernizing their systems to make them more, quote, usable. Despite riding into office on the promise to work towards a nuclear-free world, Obama left office having secured a $2 trillion, 3 decades-long plan to build a new generation of nuclear-armed missiles, bombers, and submarines, along with new nuclear warheads. Russia has also been modernizing its nuclear forces, replacing Soviet-era systems with new missile sites, new missiles, submarines, and aircraft, while developing new types of delivery systems. If an end to the war in Ukraine is successfully negotiated before it ignites a nuclear confrontation, this cliffhanger with Russia must serve as a wake-up call to get back to the business of disarmament, including renewing lapsed treaties. But in the long term, the only treaty that will truly keep us safe is the historic UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Thank you.
Well, we thank you, Medea, for those words. If we are not sufficiently scared about the use of nuclear weapons in the area of Ukraine, we are going to hear next from Trita Parsi, who will talk with us about the dangers from Israel-Gaza conflict. And this is something that at this point, so many people of all ages are very involved in. Trita Parsi is the 2010 recipient of the $200,000 Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order and the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute. He is an award-winning author with a focus on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. He was named by Washington Magazine as one of the 25 most influential voices on foreign policy in Washington, D.C. in 2021, 2022, 2023, and eminent public intellectual Noam Chomsky calls Trita Parsi one of the most distinguished scholars in Iran. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. Trita.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you so much for having me. My apologies that I'm doing this out of my car, but like Medea, I am at the protest here in Washington, D.C., and I've stepped out to speak to all of you. Let me first say that the immediate nuclear dimension to what is happening in Israel and Gaza is not in the sense that any country in the short term is going to use nuclear weapons in that war, but rather that the deterioration of the security situation, which is deteriorating fast, the war is spreading, is going to make it more likely that we will see the spread of nuclear weapons in the region, whether it's from the Iranians, whether it is from the Saudis or Turks or others. So that is and should be a very significant concern, because you can imagine what the current situation would be like if there were more nuclear weapon states and still no real diplomacy and communication between the various sides. What I want to focus my talk about today, however, is the risk of escalation in the region and the manner in which the American public can be effective in pressuring the Biden administration to pressure Israel, as well as other parties, in order to be able to de-escalate the situation. I am extremely concerned, not just by what is taking place in the region, and we've seen now that 2 days in a row, the Biden administration has chosen to escalate in order to de-escalate by attacking the Houthis in Yemen, a country that the United States, Saudi Arabia, and the UK already have been bombing for 8+ years. Now we're going back into bombing them again. And the argument, of course, is that this is needed in order to restore deterrence, in order to be able to stop the attacks by the Houthis against ships in the Red Sea, because obviously those ships apparently are more valuable than lives being lost in Gaza right now. But here's the problem. In the US media, particularly in the print media, we've reviewed it. There's hardly been any mention that the demand of the Houthis has been a ceasefire in Gaza, that the demand of the Iraqi militias that have attacked US troops have been a ceasefire in Gaza, that the attacks by Hezbollah against Israel have also been coupled with a demand for a ceasefire. Instead, the narrative that has been presented is one in which essentially the Houthis are doing this just because they're bad guys. They don't have a demand. There was an article in the New York Times yesterday that went on for, I think, almost 1,500 words with no mention of what their demand was, until that was corrected for reasons that I can't go into right now. This has then left the American public with the impression, particularly mindful of the fact how this has been presented, that when Biden chooses to use military force in Yemen, it is simply because he has no choice, because there is no demand from the Houthis. They're just doing it because they're the Houthis. And only through deterrence can these attacks be stopped. It is not so that the media necessarily has to endorse the ceasefire option or to even say that necessarily it would work. But what the media has done is to deprive the American public of even awareness that there is such an option. And that option could lead to an end to the fighting, not just the attacks in the Red Sea, but the attacks from the Iraqi militias in Hezbollah, and of course, the release of the Israeli hostages in Gaza and the end to the death and destruction in Gaza itself. That knowledge has been deprived of the American public, leaving them with the impression that Biden has simply no option but to do this. The wording that was used in the New York Times yesterday is his hands are tied. They are not. If anything, Biden has tied his own hands by not even considering the ceasefire option, and by the media not even making it sure that the American public is aware of that option. In fact, when we take a look at what happened during the 6 days between November 24th and November 30th, when there was a ceasefire for those 6 days, attacks by Iraqi militias, according to the Pentagon itself, against US troops completely stopped. Attacks by the Houthis significantly reduced. We looked into it. We could only identify one case that could clearly be attributed to the Houthis. Violence between Israel and Hezbollah also reduced. So we have clear evidence that through a ceasefire, not only can we get the release of the hostages in Israel, in Gaza, because the only time that there actually has been the release of hostages, there has been through this ceasefire. There's one Israeli soldier that was released, but it's unclear what those circumstances were outside of this ceasefire. An end to the fighting, but we can also, through that ceasefire, prevent this further escalation that very well now could lead not only to the US becoming an active party in the war, which it now has become because of the bombing of Yemen, but also not end up getting attacked and starting to see American body bags coming home and getting further drawn into what likely will become a regional war. my recommendation suggestion is that this angle, that all of this can be prevented through a ceasefire. It's not just for saving lives in Gaza, which of course is crucial, but it's also for saving American lives so that we don't end up getting dragged into a wider war in the region. I believe that that is an argument and a framing that has the potential of reaching an even larger audience of Americans who already are skeptical about the fighting in Gaza, prefer a ceasefire, but it seems to primarily be because of very natural and understandable sympathy for what the Palestinians are going through. The intensity of that sentiment is likely going to be much stronger once it is coupled with a very, very strong sentiment amongst the American public, which is that we don't want the United States to get dragged into another war. So my hope is that this angle will be further elevated in all of the advocacy that is taking place, because nothing will stop this war until Biden uses the immense leverage that the United States does have, but that he has chosen not to use. It's only when he chooses to use that or is pressured into using that, that this war will end and the escalation risk will end as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trita, and thank you for that thought of how we go about addressing or formulating our request for a ceasefire. Do you have time for some questions? Can we do that?
Yes, I have about 4 minutes, if that's okay.
Okay, let's take Robert. Can you unmute and put your question into question? Quick question for Trita.
Oh, I don't have it written, but I have it vocally.
Quick, yes.
What about the way of achieving a ceasefire? Not Israel stopping, leaving Hamas in place, able to continue what it wants. How about appealing to Hamas and asking Hamas to surrender under certain conditions? And those conditions could be that their lives would be spared, although if some of them are tried by the World Court, they could have life sentences but no deaths. But in return for surrendering and disbanding and giving up the hostages, in return for that would be a promise that within 3 years there would be a two-state solution, geographic Palestine areas in Israel, mostly the West Bank area, and all Jewish settlements on those territories, the owners would be richly compensated financially, but would all leave.
Okay, Robert, I'm going to have to stop. I'm going to have to stop you there.
So the point is,
I think that Trita
asking
knows
Hamas to surrender, not Israel to stop.
Robert, I'm going to stop you there. I think Trita knows what your question is about, and certainly it's something that one hears. Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, we do hear Blinken, for instance, saying that this war could end if Hamas just surrendered. Your proposal is that it would be coupled with a promise of them not getting imprisoned or prosecuted, and that there would be a state 3 years from now. I think a challenge we have to really be honest about is that any American promise to the Palestinian side, not only now, but for some time, carries zero credibility. And that the prospects of the Hamas giving up in return for an American promise of a state 3 years down the road, however sincere that promise may be, it simply will not work. I would put the likelihood of that being far less than the likelihood of Biden using the leverage he has with Israel, because at the end of the day, we have shipped more than 10,000 tons of weapons since October 7th to Israel. And even if we were to make the argument that the administration is making, which is that US really doesn't have much leverage with Israel, which I find frankly absurd. But even in that situation, that raises the question, then why are we sending weapons? Let's say that we don't have leverage, we can't stop it. Why are we prolonging it? Why are we fueling it? The attacks against the Houthi ships, at the end of the day, I think we have to recognize is a step in order to create greater capacity for the Israelis to continue to do what they're doing in Gaza. And I think an early impression that a lot of people had, myself included, was that Biden probably wasn't really crazy about this idea, but he was trying to find ways to convince the Israelis to not, kill 23,000 people in Gaza. I think at this point we have to be quite honest that that Biden signed up for the Israeli military objective of completely destroying Hamas. And whatever one may think about the value of that goal, reality is that goal is simply unachievable. We don't have a lot of cases in which groups of that kind have been defeated militarily. Just look at our own history. 20 years of warfare in Afghanistan, and the Taliban are back in power. And if you don't take it from me, take it from the previous Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, who about 2 weeks ago in the Haaretz wrote an op-ed, and the first sentence was that the goal of completely defeating Hamas militarily is exactly nil. These are his words. Yet Biden signed up for that option, knowing quite well our own experience indicating that it won't work, Israeli experience indicating that it won't work. I think the much more likely path is to use the leverage to force a ceasefire, which also means, incidentally, that there are no more attacks by Hamas against Israel, and then begin real negotiations. But I do think that those negotiations towards a two-state solution, the U.S. should be helpful. But any idea that the U.S. will be leading any future peace process in the region, I think is dead on arrival, because the United States simply does not have any credibility left in the region.
Thank you so much, Trita. We have 30 seconds for another question and answer, but I think we're going to have to wait on that because I no longer see Trita.
You should plan an announcement, Susan.
Oh, there he is. Yes. Okay, so let's go to Ira. Ira Helfand, would you like to make an announcement, please?
Yeah, I was asked to announce 2 upcoming webinars, one tomorrow at 10 o'clock Eastern Time that is being held by ICANN, IPPNW, and Young Professionals in Foreign Policy on our climate crisis and nuclear war. And the second, which will take place 2 weeks from today, on Saturday the 27th, between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, that is being sponsored by Pax Christi on the need to build a world free of nuclear weapons, seen as an urgent imperative. And I think both of these are going to be very useful webinars for people to attend, and just wanted to bring them to everyone's attention. Thank you.